The night before her wedding, Wren Calloway sat at the edge of her bed and counted the roses on the wallpaper. 43. She had counted them every night since she was 9 years old, when her father had moved them into the house on Pemberton Street and told her this was where she would become a woman. She had not known then what that meant. She thought she understood it now, and the understanding sat in her chest like a stone that had no intention of moving. Her father had arranged the marriage in October, 3 weeks after the doctor told him about his heart. He had not asked her opinion. He had told her at dinner, between the soup and the fish course, the way he told her most things. Quietly, finally, as though the decision had already been made in some other room she had not been invited to enter. The man's name was Dorian Ashworth. He was 31. He had land in Wiltshire, and a seat in the county, and a mother who approved of the match for reasons that had nothing to do with Wren Calloway's happiness. She had met him 4 times before the wedding. He was not unkind. That was what she told herself on the train to Wiltshire, her gloves folded in her lap, the fields going grey outside the window. He is not unkind. It was the smallest possible thing she could have said about a man she was going to live the rest of her life beside. And she knew it, and she looked at the fields and did not cry. Dorian Ashworth was not unkind. He was also not interested. Not in the way a husband is supposed to be interested in a wife. Not curious, not attentive, not the kind of man who notices when his wife has been quiet for 3 days. He was interested in his land, in the yield of the eastern fields, in the negotiations with the merchant houses in Bristol, and in his own thoughts, which he kept so carefully ordered that there was no room in them for the thought of her. He was precise and self-contained, and he ran Ashworth Hall the way a man runs a machine he built himself, efficiently without sentiment, and with very little tolerance for parts that did not fit the design he had in mind. Wren did not fit the design he had in mind. She understood this by the end of the first week. He had not been unpleasant about it. He had simply not adjusted his life to include her. He rose at 5 and breakfasted alone, and went to the fields or the study and returned for dinner and talked about the farm, or the weather or the things that needed doing, and she sat across from him and listened, and he did not ask her a single question about herself. Not one. She waited for it the way you wait for a sound you expected to hear, patient at first, then strained, then slowly, quietly, resigned. By the end of the first month, she had learned the names of every tenant on the estate. She had learned which fields drained poorly, and which needed the stone wall on the northern face repaired before winter. She had learned that Mrs. Pendleton in the village made the best bread in 3 counties, and that the vicar's wife was fighting a slow, losing battle with the ivy on the church hall. She had learned all of this because she had gone out and asked, the way she had always asked, the way her father had taught her, with her whole attention and without any agenda. She had learned it because nobody at Ashworth Hall had told her she couldn't, and because standing still and waiting to be seen had never been something Wren Calloway was able to do for very long. Dorian noticed none of it. What he noticed was the cost of the new curtains she had ordered for the east wing, which she had paid for from her own inheritance. He mentioned it at dinner. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to raise his voice to make a person feel the precise dimensions of his disapproval. He said it was not the kind of expenditure he expected to be managing, and that in future she should consult him before making changes to the house. She said she had paid for them herself and had not drawn a pound from the household accounts. There was a pause. He said that was not the point. She asked what the point was. He said that was exactly the kind of question he would have hoped she knew the answer to. She lay awake that night and counted the roses on a ceiling that had none. He had friends. Men he had known at school, and men he had done business with, and men whose land bordered his in ways that made friendship both useful and convenient. They came to Ashworth Hall twice a year for shooting weekends, and Wren managed the house during those visits. The meals, the rooms, the fires, the seamless operation of a household that was supposed to look like it ran itself. She did this without being asked to and without being thanked. Dorian accepted it the way a man accepts good weather, as something that was simply there, that required no acknowledgement, that could not possibly have taken any effort to arrange. She heard him once, from the corridor outside the billiard room. She had not been listening on purpose. She had come to tell him that dinner would be delayed by 20 minutes because the cook had burned the sauce and was beginning again, and she had stopped outside the door because she heard her name. Wren manages things well enough. One of the men had said, Hartley, she thought, from the Berkshire estate. She's quiet. She is that, Dorian said. Pretty enough, I suppose. A pause. She's competent. That's what I told my mother we needed, and that's what we got. A competent woman. Don't need much else from a country wife. She stood in the corridor for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then she walked back to the kitchen and told the cook there was no hurry, and she sat down at the kitchen table, and she pressed her hands flat against the wood, and she breathed in and out until her face was the face she needed it to be. She did not cry that night either. She was past crying by then. There is a place beyond hurt that is not numbness exactly, but is something like steadiness. A deep cold calm that comes when a person decides, without quite articulating the decision, to stop waiting for things to change and start deciding what they are going to build instead. Wren had reached that place. She took up residence there quietly, the way she did most things, and nobody noticed. The tenants noticed her. The women in the village noticed. Old Mr. Hadley, whose barn roof had been threatening to collapse for 2 years, and whom Dorian's estate manager had told 3 times there was no money in the accounts for it, came to Wren in the spring and told her the thing was nearly gone. She went and looked at it herself. She stood in that barn in her good boots in the mud and looked up at the rotting beams and said, "How many men would you need and how long would it take?" And when he told her, she said she would arrange it. She drew the funds from her own accounts again. She did not tell Dorian, but Hadley told his neighbors, and his neighbors told theirs. And within 3 months there were 6 tenants who had come to Mrs. Ashworth with problems they had stopped bringing to the estate office because the estate office never seemed to result in anything. Wren solved each one the way she solved most problems, by paying attention, asking questions, and refusing to pretend the problem wasn't there. She started keeping records. A leather ledger she bought herself in the village, small enough to fit in her coat pocket. She wrote down every conversation with every tenant, the state of each holding, the outstanding repairs, the yields that had been low for 2 seasons, and why, the families where children had gone hungry last January, and where there was a mother sick and a husband managing alone. She wrote it all down in her careful, unhurried hand. She did not know then what she would do with it. She only knew that if you do not write things down, people pretend they did not happen. Dorian had his friends down in September. The same men, the same shooting, the same seamless efficiency of the house operating invisibly around them. Hartley was there again, and a man named Briggs who had inherited his father's mill the year before and was very pleased with himself about it, and a younger man, barely 25, called Fentress, who had pale eyes and a habit of looking at Wren a moment too long. On the 3rd night, after dinner, while the men were still at the table, Wren excused herself. She heard them settle in behind her, the shift of chairs, the clink of decanters, the easy drop into the register of men who are no longer performing for a room. She heard Briggs say something about the Manchester negotiations, and she heard Dorian say they were going well enough, and then she heard Hartley say, in the unhurried voice of a man making casual conversation, "Your wife seems to have made herself useful with the tenants, Ashworth." Hadley was singing her praises at the county meeting. A pause. "Yes," Dorian said. She had stopped at the foot of the staircase. "She involves herself. They seem grateful. They seem confused about the proper order of things," Dorian said. "A wife managing tenants is not a system. It is a symptom of a system that needs attention." She went upstairs. She took off her dress and hung it carefully and sat at the dressing table and looked at her own face. She was 26 years old. She had been Mrs. Dorian Ashworth for 4 years. She was not the woman she had been on the train to Wiltshire, that still, hollow girl counting fields through the glass. She was something harder and quieter and more deliberately formed, and what she saw in the mirror was not unhappiness exactly. It was the face of a person who has made a decision and has not yet told anyone. She thought about her mother, who had died when Wren was 12. She thought about the way her mother had moved through their house, with such sureness, such purpose, as though every room belonged to her not by right but by intimate knowledge of its particular light. Her mother had known everything about their house the way you know a person, its moods, its failings, its small extraordinary moments. Wren's father had loved her mother that way too. He had never taken that for granted. He had said, more than once, that a man who does not know what he has is a man who has already lost it. He had said this quietly, the way he said most things, and it had seemed theoretical when she was 12. It did not seem theoretical now. She began writing a letter the following morning. She did not address it to anyone. She sat at the desk in the small sitting room she had claimed in the 2nd year of the marriage. A room Dorian never entered because there was nothing in it that required his attention. And she wrote down everything she had done in 4 years at Ashworth Hall. Every repair she had funded. Every tenant she had helped. Every negotiation with the merchants she had quietly managed when the estate agent was in over his head and too proud to say so. She wrote down the names and the dates and the amounts and the outcomes, and when she was finished, she had 6 pages in that careful hand, and she read them from beginning to end, and then she folded them and put them in the back of the leather ledger. She was not writing them for anyone. She was writing them to remember that she had done things, that she was real, that the 4 years were not only absence. The decision, when it finally came, arrived not as a dramatic moment, but as a quiet realization. On a Tuesday morning in November, when she was standing at the window of the sitting room, watching the first frost on the east field and thinking about the Hadley family and whether they had enough firewood for winter, the decision arrived the way true decisions always arrive, not as a new idea, but as the acknowledgement of something that had already been true for a long time. She was going to leave, not in anger, not in a scene. She was simply going to stop being invisible here and go somewhere she could be seen. Her father's cousin Josephine lived in Edinburgh. They had corresponded intermittently for years. Careful letters, fond but reserved, the letters of 2 women who know each other's character without knowing each other's daily life. Wren had not told Josephine anything about the marriage. There was nothing Josephine could have done, and Wren had never had much patience for distress that served no practical purpose. But she wrote to Josephine in November, a short letter, direct and without drama. She said she was thinking of coming north for an extended visit. She said she would explain when she arrived. She asked if the offer of the spare room still stood. Josephine wrote back within the week. The spare room always stood. Come as soon as you like. Come now if you need to. Wren told Dorian in December. She told him at dinner, the way he had always told her things. Quietly, finally, as though the decision had already been made in some other room. She said she was going to Edinburgh to stay with her cousin for some months. She said it was time for a change of scene. He looked at her across the table, and she could see him trying to find the shape of it, to fit it into the model of her he had been carrying around for 4 years. He asked what had prompted this. She said she had been thinking about it for some time. He asked how long she intended to be gone. She said she was not certain. He looked at her for a moment longer, and she met his eyes without helping him, and then he nodded and said he supposed she was due a rest, and he picked up his fork. She left on a Thursday in January. She did not make a scene of it. She packed 2 trunks, said goodbye to Mrs. Pendleton and to Hadley and to the cook, who had worked at Ashworth Hall for 30 years and who pressed Wren's hands and said nothing, which was more than enough. Dorian saw her to the carriage. He said to write when she arrived. So he knew she had traveled safely. She said she would. He said the house would manage. She thought, yes, I know, that is not the question. The train north was different from the train to Wiltshire had been. She did not look at the fields through the glass. She read a book her cousin had sent her. A novel about a woman who moved to a city and started a school and had no husband, and found this arrangement entirely satisfactory. She read it all the way to Edinburgh, and arrived at Josephine's door at 7:30 in the evening with her 2 trunks, and a lightness in her chest that she had not felt in 4 years, and that took her most of the night to identify correctly as the sensation of breathing with her whole lungs. Edinburgh was cold, and particular, and full of women with opinions. Wren fit in immediately. Josephine introduced her to the local charitable society, a group of 12 women who ran a lending library and a small fund for working women who had fallen on difficulty. And within 6 weeks Wren was running the fund's accounts, because she was the only person present who had kept a ledger for 4 years and knew how to make numbers behave. She did not tell the society about Ashworth Hall, but she brought the same habits she had developed there, the attention, the questions, the refusal to look away from things that needed doing, and the women of the society noticed. She also started teaching. A girl named Patience from the street behind Josephine's house came to the back door one morning looking for work, and Wren, who had no work to offer, asked her what she could do and what she wanted to learn. And the girl said she could cook and sew, and she wanted to learn to write better because she had ideas and no way to put them down. Wren taught her every morning for 6 weeks. Then Patience brought a friend, and the friend brought a sister, and by February there were 4 girls at Josephine's kitchen table every morning at 8 o'clock, learning to write in a way that made their ideas visible. Word gets around. Not the dramatic kind of word that announces itself, the quiet kind, that moves from mouth to mouth over fences and in dry goods shops and at the ends of church pews. The word was that Mrs. Ashworth, whoever she was, whoever's wife she had been, was the kind of person who paid attention and did something about what she saw. At Ashworth Hall, things began to go wrong, not catastrophically. Dorian was too precise for catastrophe, but persistently, in the low-level way that things go wrong when the person who had been quietly preventing problems is no longer there to prevent them. The Hadley barn, which Wren had repaired, was fine, but the drainage on the east field that she had been monitoring and planning to address in spring went unaddressed, and in March the flooding was bad enough to lose a quarter of the planting. The merchant negotiation she had been quietly steering for 2 seasons came undone without her eyes on it. 3 tenants who had been struggling came to the estate office and left without help and did not come back. Dorian's estate manager, a man called Pruitt, who had worked for the family for 20 years and who had never admitted to needing help from anyone, came to Dorian in April and said that there were matters on the estate that had been managed without his knowledge and that he was now finding gaps where he had expected solid ground. He said this diplomatically, which was his way. Dorian read between the diplomatic lines, which was his way, and went through the estate records, and began to understand. It was not that things had fallen apart. It was that he had not known what was being held together. He went to the tenants. He went to Hadley first, because Hadley was straightforward and had no talent for concealment. And Hadley, who had admired Dorian's father and liked Dorian in the abstract but had seen very little of him in practice, told him plainly what Mrs. Ashworth had done and for how long. He told him about the barn. He told him about the family in February 2 years ago, whose child had been sick and whose wife had been managing alone, and how Mrs. Ashworth had come and arranged things without being asked and without making a sermon of it. He told him that she had kept a record of every holding on the estate, and that she had known the name of every person on the land and the specific trouble of each. Dorian went to 4 more tenants. They all told him variations of the same story. He went back to Ashworth Hall and sat in the study and looked out at the east field where the drainage had failed. And he thought about the dinner where he had told Hartley that Wren's involvement with the tenants was a symptom. He thought about the corridor conversation he did not know she had overheard. He thought about the word competent and what a precise and utterly insufficient word it was for what she had actually been. He wrote her a letter. It took him 6 drafts, which was unusual for a man of his precision. The first 5 drafts were competent. He burned them one after another at the study fire because he kept writing around the thing he needed to say instead of toward it, and he was aware enough of his own habits to know when he was doing that. The 6th letter was short. He wrote that he had spoken to the tenants and that he understood, now, the scope of what she had done. He wrote that he had not understood it before because he had not been paying attention, and that not paying attention was a choice he had made without calling it a choice, and that he was aware this did not excuse it. He wrote that he would like to speak with her if she was willing, and that he would come to Edinburgh or she could return as she chose, and that either way he would not pretend the last 4 years had been something other than what they were. He did not write that he missed her. He was still, in that 6th draft, not quite ready to put that down in writing, but he was aware that the sentence was true. Wren received the letter on a Thursday. She read it at the kitchen table while the girls were arriving for their morning lesson. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the pocket of her apron and went on with the lesson, because Patience was having difficulty with a particular construction and it needed to be addressed. She wrote back that evening. She said she had read his letter carefully and that she appreciated the directness of it. She said she was willing to speak with him. She said there were things that would need to change, not as conditions but as realities. Things she needed to be true in order to return and build a life at Ashworth that she could call her own. She wrote these things plainly. She did not dress them up and she did not apologize for them. She said she had been invisible for 4 years and she did not intend to be invisible again, and that if he could not understand why that mattered, then they had nothing further to discuss. She sent the letter in the morning and then walked to the lending library and spent the afternoon reorganizing the cataloging system, which had been constructed in 1849 and had not been reconsidered since. Dorian came to Edinburgh. He did not send word ahead. He arrived on a Tuesday and knocked at Josephine's door, and when Wren opened it, there was a pause of approximately 4 seconds during which neither of them said anything. She looked the same, he thought. She did not look the same. She looked like a person who had finished becoming something and was now simply being it, and he found he did not know how to approach that with the familiar language he had always used. She took him into the front sitting room and they sat and she waited, the way she had always waited, without helping him and without filling the silence for him. He had to fill it himself this time. He did. He told her about Hadley. He told her about Pruitt and the gaps. He told her about the drainage on the east field, and about the merchant negotiation, and about going through the estate records and finding her everywhere in them, in the spaces between the official entries, in the things that had been solved before they became problems. He told her that he had said something to his friends about her once. He did not specify when, that he was ashamed of. He used that word. She noted it. She told him she knew what he had said. She told him she had been standing in the corridor. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he supposed he had always known she was there, and had chosen not to think about what that meant, and that was the same as not knowing, but it wasn't, it was worse, because it meant he had known and had not cared to look, and that was the particular failure he was going to have to sit with. It was the most precise and honest thing he had ever said to her. She recognized it as such. She did not let it change the conversation immediately. Some things need to land before you can move from them. But she recognized it. They talked for 2 hours. She told him what she needed, not what she wanted, not what would make her happy in some abstract sense, but the specific practical things that had to be true. She needed to manage the charitable work she had started here. She was not prepared to abandon Patience and the others. She needed her name on the estate correspondence when it involved the tenants she had built relationships with. She needed to be told about decisions that affected the household and the land. Not afterward as a courtesy, but before, as a person whose understanding of the situation was relevant. She said all of this in the same tone she used to talk about the lending library accounts. Not angry, not cold, just clear, in the way that clear is its own kind of force. He agreed to all of it. She could see that he meant it, which mattered. She had spent 4 years watching a man perform the motions of a life he had not really chosen. She could tell the difference between performance and intention. She returned to Ashworth Hall in April. Not for him, or not only for him. For the East Field that needed sorting before summer, for Hadley and the others, for the particular project of a life she had begun to build in that stone house that was not finished yet, and that she had realized, in Edinburgh, she was not yet ready to leave unfinished. She returned for herself, which was the only way to return. The day she came back, the tenants along the northern road came out to see the carriage pass. She did not know they had planned it. She had not told anyone the specific day. But there they were, Hadley with his cap in his hand, and the women from the 3 nearest holdings and 2 of the young men who had come to Pruitt's office in those lean winter months, and found no help. She saw them from the window of the carriage, and something in her chest that had been held at a careful distance came forward of its own accord. And she pressed her hand briefly to the glass. Dorian saw it. He said nothing. But she felt him, beside her, shift slightly, the way a man shifts when he is revising something. At the county meeting in June, which she had never attended before, because she had not been invited and had not pushed, Dorian stood and said that the accounts of Ashworth Hall had been misrepresenting what the estate was built on for 4 years, because the foundation of it, the tenant relationships, the forward planning, the knowledge of the land that went down past the fields to the people on them, had been the work of his wife, and he had not said so, and he was saying so now. He said her name. He said it clearly, in a room full of men who had known him for 20 years, and who had never heard him talk about her as anything other than the household. The room was quiet for a moment. Wren, who was sitting to his left, which was also a first, looked down at her hands. Not from humility. She had moved past humility in Edinburgh. But from the particular feeling of hearing the truth spoken out loud in a room that had been making do with the polite fiction for a long time. Hartley, who was seated across the table, caught her eye afterward. He looked, she thought, like a man who had recently been invited to revise a number of assumptions. Good. There was a lot of revision available. She squeezed Dorian's hand once under the table, quickly, before she withdrew it. He had not earned everything yet. They both knew that, but he was trying in the particular way that matters. Not the performance of trying, but the work of it, which is unglamorous and daily and never quite finished. She could work with that. She had always worked with incomplete materials. It was one of the things she was very good at. On the train back from the county meeting, she took out the leather ledger. Not to write anything. The meeting was over, and the record of it would keep. She took it out because she wanted to hold it, the way you hold something that reminds you of the longest version of yourself. She had started it 4 years ago, in a house where no one was watching. She had kept it through the silences, and the corridors, and the dinners, that asked nothing of her. She had carried it to Edinburgh, and kept it there, and she had carried it back, and it was full now, full the way things get when a person refuses to let moments disappear. She looked out the window. The fields were green in the June light, not the gray fields of the first train, not the fields she had counted to keep herself still. Different fields. Her fields, in the sense that mattered, not property, not legal title, but the sense that comes from having looked hard at something, and known it and chosen it again. She closed the ledger and put it in her coat pocket and watched the countryside move past, and she did not count anything.